So this week we're going to be studying the Gospel of Luke, which is the last of the three synoptic Gospels. Remember, the synoptic Gospels are Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and they share a similar point of view, and in fact, Matthew and Luke probably used Mark as a source, as well as either a well-known set of oral traditions or an earlier written set of the teachings of Jesus, and along with traditions unique to their own communities. Luke's Gospel does something that the others don't. It gives us a little bit more information about the author. Specifically, in some verses we'd be likely to skip over. In Luke 1, he begins his gospel this way. Many people have set in to write accounts about the events that have been fulfilled among us. They use the eyewitness reports circulating among us from the early disciples. Having carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I also have decided to write a careful account for you, most honorable Theophilus, so that you can be certain of the truth of everything that you've been taught. While the author doesn't identify himself as Luke, who was a physician, who was a companion of Paul, the apostle, and certainly as we study Paul's life, if anybody needed a doctor for a friend, it was him. But the tradition of Luke, the physician, being the author of this gospel is pretty old. It goes back to about the 150s with Papias, who's an early church leader. What this gospel introduction, though, this frontispiece to the gospel does, is tell us a couple of things. One, it tells us this gospel writer is not an eyewitness to these events. He's very open about that from the beginning, and that's something that was very traditionally believed about this gospel. But the author of the gospel himself simply says, I wasn't there. I'm working as a historian. I'm using the accounts that others have written. I'm using eyewitness reports. I'm using the tradition of the church, which is, all of 30 years old, 40 years old at the point of the writing. But he is gathering together all of his source materials to construct an account. And he acknowledges there are some other accounts floating around out there. There are other gospels, other stories of the life of Jesus floating around in this mid-first century. We can date the writing of this book somewhere between 70 and 85 AD. So we're talking about a 15-year window of time when this book likely came to be. And he is aware that there are other gospels, there are other gospel accounts, whether he means Mark and Matthew, whether he means Mark, and he certainly probably does since he uses so much of that material, or other accounts we no longer have today. We can't be totally sure. But he is specifically writing this gospel using source material, and he addresses these almost like as a dedication to someone named Theophilus. Now, it's pretty common if you were to pick up a book today and you look at the opening pages, you might find a dedication like written to my wife, Billy Sue, or Tiffany Ann, for all the help that they are to me, or something of that nature. Back in that time, if you were writing a book, especially one that involves historical research and processes like Luke would have used, you might have needed a patron, someone to help you with the expense of that. So Luke uses in these 4 verses what is, in terms of academic construction, the best quality New Testament Greek that we find in the entire New Testament. In his introduction and dedication, he mentions the name Theophilus. That could very well be the name of a wealthy patron who's an early believer who's footing the bill for Luke to actually construct this gospel account. Or it could be a coded word. Theophilus literally means, when translated from Greek, friend of God. So it could be that this is written to all the friends of God, or all those that are loved by God or in love with God. And that's kind of wrapped up into one person, the identity of Theophilus. This book, this gospel, is the first of a 2-part set that's written by the same author. The Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts share a common introduction, common vocabulary, and are almost generally universally accepted to be written by the same author that we were going to call Luke for our purposes here, since that's the traditional authorship and the name of the book. It has been since about the 150s. So a couple of things here. This person is not an eyewitness, and that's okay. There's still an inspired writer that God is leading and using to create this text. If we want to talk about that in a faith context, having been there didn't add to his credibility. But what he does is go through all of the available source materials and people who were there to construct an account that's designed to help people know that their faith in Jesus is not something foolish or not something in vain, but it's something they can depend on. And he's dedicating this to Theophilus, or all the friends of God, to help us know the certainty of the things that we've been taught. So Luke is going to approach the story of Jesus, who had been crucified and died and was resurrected, just maybe 30, 40 years before, like a historian. He's going to gather his source materials, he's going to utilize the other accounts, and he's going to construct his account very carefully. A few things that are different about Luke's account. If you remember in Matthew's gospel has such a Jewish Christian influence that he blocks the teachings of Jesus off into 5 great blocks of teaching. Luke doesn't do that. He has some of the same material that we would find in the Sermon on the Mount or in other great parts of Jesus' teaching, but instead of having it categorized into neat blocks of teaching, just imagine dropping a hand grenade into one of those neatly comprised blocks of teaching and exploding that. And it appears in different chunks and in different places throughout the gospel, and it serves a different reason. Something interesting about this gospel is it pays very special attention to women. There's even a parable in which God is said to be like a woman, and that's kind of unusual in this first century world. But Luke pays a lot of attention to women. He pays a lot of attention to children, and he deals a lot with themes of social and economic justice, particularly with the rich oppressing the poor or oppressing those whom they hold as slaves or as servants. That's a huge concern for Luke. Now, while I'm not necessarily advocating the traditionally assumed authorship of Luke, the disciple of, or a friend of Paul, it is possible in this instance that he may indeed have been the author. When we think of a physician today, we think of generally someone who is quite wealthy and independently wealthy through their practice of medicine. That would not have been true in the first century. Many people who were physicians were like artisans, like blue-collar workers in terms of their wages and how they lived. So he would have been a well-educated person and a trained person, but also would have been kind of a blue-collar worker in terms of his socioeconomic status, or even a slave owned by a rich person who wanted their own personal doctor. So that may explain Luke's heart for the poor. Matthew, when Jesus says certain things like, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. Luke simply says, blessed are those who hunger and thirst, for they shall be filled. So Matthew might spiritualize some of the material, some scholars have said, whereas Luke makes it more concrete and about socioeconomic realities faced by actual people instead of just a spiritual principle that can be applied by everybody. And that's debated by scholars, and that could be differences in the way that they shape the materials or differences in the way Jesus said certain things at different times. Because remember, the teaching that we have in Jesus in all the Gospels may not be just something he did once, but some of it may be representative teachings, like his greatest hits kind of put together for us. Luke's Gospel is very well organized, and it begins with an account of the nativity and how Jesus' birth came to be and the miracles surrounding that, and it progresses through a sequence of events. And we're going to talk about those in some detail